I've been in Jewish missions for 25 years. When this dawned upon me 25 years ago, I said, Lord, what can I do? We're in trouble. And so I began to get into Jewish missions, first of all as a volunteer and then into full-time mission. I'd like to share with you then my testimony, how I came to that position. And I'm watching the clock. I won't take too long. Let me tell you about myself then, and how I came to this position of where I am today. My story begins in the Kiev region of what was then known as Russia. Today it's known as the Ukraine. My story begins in the Kiev region, or the Kiev region of Russia, in the late 1800s. One great-grandparent was a man named Aaron Cooperman. Aaron was a bookkeeper in a flour mill, and he was also a Jewish scribe. He wrote out the Torah scrolls by hand. And there are faint indications that he might have been a Levite. He might be from the tribe of Levi. So I might have a Levitical connection. I don't know at this point. I'd have to research that out a little further. Well, he died young, leaving a daughter who was my grandmother, and she eventually immigrated to New York City. Her name was Esther Cooperman. She was born in Kiev region of Russia in 1888. And exactly when her family immigrated to the New World is uncertain. All that I can piece together at this point is that she was living in New York City, married, and gave birth to my mother all by 1915. Now, my other great-grandparents descended from a man named Meir Zolotushka. How do you like that name? Meir Zolotushka. Meir was a horse trader, and he also lived in the Kiev region of Russia in the city of Buki. And by the way, Kiev is near, just a little south of Chernobyl. You're all familiar with Chernobyl? You remember that nuclear accident that happened a while back? Just go a little south and you'll come to Kiev, okay? The Chernobyl area. Well, Meir and his wife bore two sons, Morris and Jacob, and they also immigrated to New York City, the New World. Upon reaching the USA, their name was changed from Zolotushka to Silver. Now, why, I don't know. Anyone here know Ukrainian or Russian? I don't know what Zolotushka means. I got to look that up. But it got changed from Zolotushka to Silver. So if they hadn't changed their name, my name would be very different. Okay? Oh, I shouldn't say that. My grandfather, well, then Morris Silver, was born in 1886 in Buki, Russia. And he took up the occupation of a tailor here in the United States. And then in New York City, Morris and Esther met and married. And unfortunately, they experienced a very, very unhappy marriage. As a child, I can only remember them being separated. One lived in the Bronx, one lived in Brooklyn. And when we visited my grandparents, we would go and stay with my grandmother and then visit my grandfather in the other borough. I assume they had happier days, and in their happier days, they bore two children, my Uncle Jules and my mother, Sadie Carol Silver, his younger sister. So my mother was born in 1915 in New York City, and she always hated her given name Sadie. She went by her middle name Carol. She thought Sadie was too provincial. Carol was a little more dignified name. Now, she was the one on whom this immigrant family placed all their hopes. She was the one who was to study, 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 and make good in the New World. So as a result, she was never taught to cook or clean. She was never taught any of that stuff, no homemaking. She never even carried her books to school. My Uncle Jules carried her books. She was the pampered one. And the family's hope was not disappointed. My mother graduated from Hunter College High School, a school for gifted girls, in 1932. She was 17. She went on to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1936 from Hunter College with a concentration in mathematics. She was 21. Now, she told me that at one time in her life, she had a choice between pursuing, get this, on one hand, nuclear physics, and on the other hand, art. Now, that seems like two disparate choices, doesn't it? Nuclear physics and arts. Now, she knew that if she took the path of nuclear physics, she would eventually be working on the development of the atomic bomb. She knew that at that time. So she took the path of art instead. She didn't want to work on the atomic bomb. So she was a very, very bright young lady, very ahead of her time. We'd call her a feminist today. Now, New York City was an Orthodox environment. And so my mother observed her friends following all our traditions. So she went to the local rabbi with the question, why do we observe all these traditions? And the rabbi, unfortunately, gave her a very typical rabbinic answer. Don't do this to your kids. Don't give your kids this answer. They said to her, don't ask questions, just do it. And that's a typical rabbinic answer right down to today. And that is not the answer. You give a bright young lady who's way ahead of her time, who's making a choice between nuclear physics and art. You don't just go give her an answer like that. And she said to me, Bob, I couldn't just do it. I had to know why. And so she made her break with the rabbis, and she went looking for a religion that she said wasn't so narrow as Rabbinic Judaism. So as a youngster, I watched my mother try religion after religion after religion, and eventually, as I told you, she settled down on Vedanta, which is a sect of Hinduism. She became a Hindu. So as a result, my brother and I, and by the way, I am a twin. I'm a fraternal twin. If my brother was standing here, he'd be a good 6 inches taller than me. We have totally different personalities, look totally different, but we are twins. I'm the firstborn. So anyway, my brother and I were familiar with our Jewishness and familiar with Jewish tradition. My mother did want us to identify as Jewish men, but it was a cultural identity only. It was a cultural identity fostered by activities in the Jewish community center, rather than attendance in a synagogue. So I was familiar with the Bible, I was familiar with biblical traditions, I was familiar with Jewish celebrations, but being Jewish meant nothing to me as a child. Now, my mother felt we could choose our own religion when we grew to adulthood, and she was quite happy that I came to believe in Jesus as Messiah, but she was incensed at evangelism. Just don't force him on me, Bob. Don't force him on anybody. See, that's a Hindu point of view. Everybody just gets along. And your religion is as good as my religion, and that's what she believed in. Just don't force him on anybody. So she would get incensed with me when I would try to tell her and others about Yeshua. Now, in New York City, she met a dashing young Nebraska farm boy named Roger Morris. They were married in 1947. She was 32 years old. Now, my mother was a sophisticated, intellectual, fine arts-oriented city girl. And my dad was a down-to-earth Nebraska farm boy who chose a career in the U.S. Navy. This dissimilar mix of people was destructive, and they experienced a very turbulent and unhappy marriage that was aggravated by my father's slide into alcoholism and my mother's slide into neurosis. So my brother and I were born into what we call today a dysfunctional family. So I was born on October 29th, 1947 in Newport, Rhode Island, firstborn son of a Jewish mother and a Gentile father. I was circumcised and redeemed in accordance with Jewish law by the local rabbi. But beyond that, my brother and I received no spiritual training. So as a teenager, I rejected my Jewishness on a religious basis, and I only grudgingly accepted my heritage as Jewish. I remember having an argument with my mother. You know, when you're a teenager, you have an occasional argument with your parents. You know how it is, right? Once in a while. I don't remember what the argument was about. All I can remember was her standing over me and shaking her finger at me and going, "But you're Jewish!" What does that mean, Mom? How is that relevant to anything? I didn't know what the definition of being a Jew is. Does that mean we speak Hebrew, Mom? I don't speak Hebrew. Does that mean we live in Israel? We live in Seattle, Washington. We're not in Israel. Does that mean we go to the synagogue? We don't go anywhere religiously. Does it mean I have genes in my bloodstream? I'd hit upon it. I didn't even know it. I'd hit upon the correct definition of who is a Jew. The correct definition, the biblical definition, a Jewish person is a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That I was. But how did that relate to anything? So what if I had these certain genes flowing around in my bloodstream? You know, you pulled blood out of me, you didn't see stars of David floating around in the blood. You know? What does that mean? So in 1966, 1967, during my sophomore year at the University of Washington, I graduated from Queen Anne High School in Seattle and went to the University of Washington. And during that year, my sophomore year, I encountered genuine Christians. The first guy was a missionary with Campus Crusade for Christ. You've heard of them, right? I'm eating my lunch one day in the Husky Union building. This guy says, "Is this chair open?" "Sure, sit down there, no big deal." what does this sly missionary do? He first starts talking about general things, then he manipulates the conversation around a God, and then he manipulates the conversation around a Jesus, then he whips out this little booklet, The Four Spiritual Laws. And I was interested in God. I had no problem with that. And he goes through this book with me, and then there's this prayer at the end. Would you like to pray this prayer, accepting Jesus as your Savior? Wait a second. Hang on now. This Jesus guy is nice, but isn't this a little fanatical? The only way to God? I mean, here, it's the mid-60s. There's a Vietnam War protest going on outside the building. It's the time of Timothy Leary, you know, free drugs, free everything. I never got into that stuff. But this was the whole culture that I was part of. Jesus, the only way to God? Isn't this a little narrow? Well, he gave me the tract. And I took it because I was interested in this God thing. He said he'd pray for me, but I thought, oh, nice guy, but just a little bit fanatical. Just a little bit, you know, out to lunch. Well, after that, I then began dating a Christian girl. I wouldn't advise you to do missionary dating, but I guess that's what she was doing. And she would take me to the one of the Christian groups on campus. I don't remember which one it was. All I remember is they had something I didn't have. They had two things. Number one, these kids talked with God. Now, I always believed God was out there. I had no problem with that. I remember in junior high biology class, coming out of junior high biology class and doing this, because the teacher just explained to me about all the joints and how they lubricate themselves and repair themselves, and all the electrical impulses flowing up and down to my brain, and all the chemistry in the muscles that were being injected and allowing my muscles to do all this, and it repaired itself. And I looked at that thing and I said, that is an incredible tool. That didn't happen by accident. That was constructed by somebody and designed by somebody. There's a God out there. Never had any problem believing in God. General revelation, you know. So I always believed in God. But he was just the big man upstairs, you know. No personal relationship with him. He just started the world going, and okay, great design, but that's all there is to it. These guys talked with him. They prayed. Never experienced that before in my life. I didn't do that. I was impressed. Secondly, these